John chapter 11, verse 50, Caiaphas saying, it is expedient that one person should die rather than the whole nation should die. And we're examining the idea of substitutionary sacrifice. So I want to look at the way in which what Caiaphas said is right, is profoundly true. There's a way in which it's false, it's selfish, it's self-centered. He dies so that I don't have to. But in another way, it's the real center of Christianity. And my point has been this, that this principle of substitutionary sacrifice is not a theological idea at all. It is a life idea. It's the very being where we are. It's the whole root and ground of the way that we live altogether. We start, you can look into the vegetable kingdom, how the tree dies so that the young tree comes up. You can look in the animal kingdom, one animal dies so that another might live. And you can look in the human kingdom. You can look where we are and think how every blessing that we enjoy derives from the suffering of others. We start our lives in childbirth, and a mother goes through sometimes extreme pain so that another life might be produced, one suffering on behalf of another. Our very roots are in the law of sacrifice. The point I'm trying to make is that this is the way that God lives towards the world. And it's something that's instinctive and deep inside us. There is no blessing that we enjoy that did not come from the suffering of another. You think of the suffering that pioneers go through, macheting their way through the jungle, clearing the ground for new towns to come up so that settlers can come in. Every settler lives in a blessing that's produced by the suffering of a pioneer. You think of political systems, exactly the same, that we go through the wrangle of tribes warring into some forms of justice and parliament and some forms of democracy. Even if you have all the criticism in the world about our present government systems, sure, but you realise that the present freedom comes from past suffering. And think of Remembrance Day and the tag where it says, lest we forget. And of course the point is, lest we forget what? Lest we forget that people have died to make our freedom possible. One suffers, another lives. It's the whole crux of the way we are. I really believe it. We live by this law. We live by it instinctively. And when we recognize it as the way that God lives towards the world, we enter more fully into his reality, into spiritual reality. Now you may evade it, and you may take the Caiaphas route of saying, oh, let him die so that I can live. I'm just going to tread on these people on my ladder to success. I don't care about anybody else. Better that he should die rather than I should suffer. That's the Caiaphas route of selfishness and self-centeredness. But when you enter into God's way of understanding sacrifice and blessing, it was the consciousnus of Christ's surrender to God's will and the voluntary nature of that sacrifice that made Jesus' sacrifice real and proper and right and good. He said, no one takes my life from me. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. If Jesus had come the Caiaphas route, you'd have seen him dragged, screaming to the cross. A victim. Still a victim, but not a real sacrifice. And if Jesus had died that way, you might have compassion on him. Oh, isn't that terrible what they did to him? But you wouldn't have much more, would you? That's all you would have, is just compassion on a helpless victim. But this, when Jesus went knowingly setting his face like a flint towards Jerusalem, he is setting himself and God's will in total opposition to the Caiaphas principle. Complete, steady, unflinching reliance on God's power and dependence on God's will. No compromise at all. No compromise to every one of the forms of sin, knowing that he's going to be a victim, but not just a lamb slain unconsciously on a Jewish altar, but the sacrifice, the world's sacrifice, what humanity should look like. Christ is the human, the true human, doing what humans are meant to do, inspiring and exemplifying and showing what life is. Because it was not merely a sacrifice, it was a sacrifice for sin. His soul was made an offering for sin. And even more than that, for the world's sin. The whole spirit of Caiaphas is being challenged by the sacrifice of Christ. Do you see that? The two in total opposition. So John chapter 11 verse 50 is such an important crux. You either read it in Caiaphas' spirit or you read it in God's spirit. And they are absolute irreconcilable opposites. And Caiaphas was prophesying, according to John, almost unknowingly, that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. Isn't that a fantastic verse? In one sacrifice, he gathers together the scattered children of God. It's already bursting out of the shell of Judaism to embrace the whole world. Jesus died for the world's sin. Now you've got to think about this carefully and consider it very, very closely. This is meat and serious business. God has a cross. And the cross of God is the way he lives towards the world. And the sacrifice of Christ is the meaning of life itself. And that's why Christians wear a cross around their neck. It's not just a symbol of an executioner's gibbet. It's not just a scaffold or an electric chair. It is the meaning of life, because this is how God lives towards the world. You look at the symbols of other religion and they say something very powerful about the concept of God: serenity, power, submission. And the cross says one thing. He says givingness, sacrifice. We'll leave it there for today. Let these words rest on your spirit and consider them, and may you be blessed.